It's no secret that Scotland is a magical place. I mean, look how beautiful the Highlands are. But what happens when you combine Scottish fairy tale with the Cthulhu mythos? The Secrets of the Glen was written by John Hall, and this scenario investigates what it would look like to combine these two things. I'm XPLovecat, and today I'm going to be walking through this scenario, providing my thoughts and top tips for running it. This is a longer one-shot scenario. It took my players and I 6 hours to complete, and takes place in modern-day Scotland. Now, the basic setup is that your investigators get a call from a real estate mogul, and he wants their help in evaluating the Scottish area that he wants to place a new resort in. You know the drill, there's going to be spoilers moving forward. Right away, my biggest tip for keepers is to lean into the two strengths of the scenario. And the first is the setting. So balancing the intention of the mogul wanting to kind of ruin the Scottish landscape with this extravagant resort versus the needs and desires of the locals who would want to preserve this land. So make sure to look up pictures of Scotland and the beautiful nature to be able to describe it and set the scene for your players. The second strength to lean into is the fairy tale lore. So there's a lot of opportunities for trickery and fun things to explore with all of this Scottish background fairy tales to really capture that and have fun with it as well. As you read the intro to the scenario, it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what's going on. I did find myself having to flip through the different pages to try and put all the pieces of the story together so I understood the overall picture. So I'm going to do my best to summarize what is really happening here. On the site that the investigators are going to, there's a battle going on between Fairyland and Siega, which I definitely know I'm not pronouncing that right, but this is a great old one who has been summoned by a ritual. Now, he's too large to actually be in the location, but the tentacles are up and disturbing the lock and has led to a murder. So this doesn't sit very well with the fairies and the monster of the loch, who is actually protecting the Glen. And of course, this is based off of the Loch Ness Monster. The Glen is home to fairies, pixies, and a kelpie. So it's up to the investigators to slowly discover these creatures, learn about them, and decide how much they want to help with this battle, and how they will ally to defeat the Great Old One. Now again, this wasn't really summarized anywhere, so just be careful as you're reading the scenario to take notes to really understand everything that's happening here. I'm going to hit on the most important locations, but this scenario is pretty sandboxy, so it's not required that your players would go in any specific order. Let's talk about Fairyland first. There's actually multiple ways that your players can enter Fairyland, and in this they can see the Glen, but they can't necessarily interact with the real world. Now, I really appreciated the description of Fairyland because it wasn't what I typically would have expected. It is night in Fairyland. It is always night. The darkness is, in fact, so complete that it goes beyond darkness and shapes are visible once more. The Glen is still visible in Fairyland, though it is a pale shadow of its former self. Fairyland is pretty essential to the scenario because that's where you can actually interact with the Fae. So this is a cool opportunity to do some of that trickster bartering, and it's fun if your players learn that they can easily be bribed by alcohol. So that's a good way and path to have some fun with Fairyland and interact directly with the Fae. Next is the abandoned caravan park. So this is a good chance to mention that the mogul has a list of specific things that he wants the investigators to check out. Now, I really liked having this list for guidance to be able to make sure my players were going to different locations, but I wouldn't be so prescriptive about what exactly needs to be done each specific day. That way it gives your players a little bit more freedom on the route and different order that they would visit these locations. Next is the forest, which includes some fairy fun. So they definitely made my players get lost, which ended up with one of my players climbing up high into a tree to try and figure out the lay of the land. But while he was up in the tree, a particular fairy liked to mess with him. So just be aware, this is a really good chance to introduce the Fae and make your players understand that there's a little bit more going on here than just what you see on the surface of the Glen. Within the forest, there's also some standing stones, which is another way that you can get into fairyland. So this was where things really kicked off for my group. One of the players that touched the standing stones immediately was transported to fairyland. This is a great chance to pull the investigator aside and talk them through the darkness and kind of what they see, so they feel like they have a little bit of a secret and there's more suspense at the table. Now, again, it wasn't super clear how you could get out of fairyland, so I just kind of went with it. One of the methods that was listed in the scenario was the lady in green, and this fairy can help transport your players back to reality. At first, she's more just into the pranking to get them back and less an actual telling the story. The lady in green can be really helpful for later in the scenario if your players need help filling in the gaps of what's happening in the scenario. But I wouldn't do that until there's actually been some proper investigation. Next, we come to the beach, and here's where we find a pixie burrow. And the pixies are not very happy folk. So they're definitely going to mess with the investigators if they get too close. This might also be an opportunity for them to meet Will the Kelpie, who's taking the form of an old man fishing. Now, Will the Kelpie is my favorite NPC, and there was a lot of cool deals that happened at the end of the scenario to help my investigators out of a pretty rough spot. So definitely take advantage of the Kelpie and at first introduce him just as a normal guy, and slowly he'll just start appearing in these weirder places and they will definitely catch on that there's something more to this guy. This is where your investigators are going to find Sarah Rice's body, who was unfortunately killed by one of the tentacles from the Great Old One. This is where some proper investigation starts to take place, and they will likely make their way to Kilmorey, which is the small fishing village right next to the Glen. You can have a lot of fun with this setting and in exploring the inn and the library and talking to the locals. So keep in mind the locals probably won't be super happy that the investigators are here trying to build a resort on their land. So there might be some psychology or social skills used to get more conversation out of the locals. This is also a great way to get your players back on track and understanding the connection with the Fae if they're not quite sure what's going on, because the locals are definitely going to be well versed in Scottish folklore and might tell them a few stories. The village is also where they're going to meet Harriet Kilkenny, who was part of this original ritual that kicked off all of this madness. This is likely going to lead the investigators to the McCartney farm, where the actual location of this book that the ritual is in is located, and this is necessary for closing the rift of this Great Old One. So if that's something that your players are going to go down that path, they're definitely going to need that book to complete it. At the farm, there's also going to be some mayhem with the pixies going on. There's an old tractor that just keeps breaking down, some other mischief happening. So it's fun to also bring those pixies in again and start sprinkling in some trickery. Next is the getaway. This is where Sarah Rice was staying, and that's when she heard the call of the servants to go towards the loch. So unfortunately, she did follow that call and was grabbed by a tentacle. But what I really love about this location is the story behind it. So your investigators will likely notice that it's the same style of the houses that was in the village, but she's around this area that doesn't have any other houses. The owner of the getaway, Natasha Grant, she was so hoping to be the nicest cottage on the street. So she met the Kelpie, and the Kelpie definitely made that happen by transporting her across the lake so that she didn't have any other houses on the street. So that's just a really great example of the different deals or loopholes that the Kelpie's going to use if your investigators end up wanting his help. Another avenue to get into Fairyland is the Fairy Stone. So the scenario does mention that there's a plaque with some brief history about the stone, but unfortunately there wasn't a handout to give me any guidance of what the plaque says, so I do wish there was a little bit more information there that I could give to my players. And my cat has demanded to be on my lap, apparently. So the fairy stone also is a way to give your investigators some visions from these servants, similar to what Sarah would have experienced. Now, unfortunately, the scenario didn't give any pre-made guidance on what these visions would look like, which I think would have been really cool. But you as a keeper can be creative and come up with some of these beforehand so that you're prepared. I do want to quickly mention the art behind me is by Matt Stricker, who is also Reaching for Divine. And look how incredible these pieces are. If you would like to check him out and his work, I'll link that information in the description below. The final location is the caves, and I really wish that I had a map for this because there's different tunnels and different paths that investigators can go to this main location, which is where the Fairyland Anchor is being held and where the ultimate battle is going to be taking place. So you might want to draft out a map of what this might look like to aid you during this play session. I did love the different encounters that were available for the caves, and one of these encounters is with Will the Kelpie. So if they haven't really figured it out to this point, he's able to fill in the gaps and try to recruit the players to help him save the Glen. Now, recruit is a soft word, I suppose, because he might force them to participate in exchange for something that they're really looking for in their lives. This will all culminate in the final battle, and my biggest tip here is to really make it epic for your players. I mean, just try to envision this for a moment. We have monster, tentacles, servants, pixies, fairies, kelpie, the lady in green, and the investigators. Think of the chaos going on here. So for that reason, I wouldn't recommend playing out the entire battle with rolls. I do think it would be fun to have some initial fighting, brawling rolls just to figure out their tactics as they're going through this battle and try and get some of the information of the strategy that they're using, just so it brings some life to the battle. But it's going to take way too long to roll out every single thing and resolve this battle. So after a little bit of time and making sure that you're reading the table, you can lean into their alliances to determine victory or defeat. If players have successfully aligned themselves with at least two of the factions, I would rule this as victory. If they did not end up making alliances or only managed to get aligned with one, then I would ultimately rule this a defeat. Now, my players did not do a very good job of aligning with these different factions, and they ended up being forced into the battle with Will the Kelpie, and in order to survive, made some pretty odd deals. One of my players was very vain, and so in order for her to be saved from death, Will the Kelpie took some of her appearance points, which is the mechanical version of what happened, and this made her look entirely different than she looked before. So although she was saved, when she went back home, she looked very different, and none of her friends and family thought that it was really her. So she had to basically start her life all over. That gives you an example of just different deals and ways that you can use Will the Kelpie. My players ended up retreating from battle and told the real estate mogul that if he really wanted to build in the Glen that he could, knowing that he would probably run into a lot of issues and not be successful in running his retreat. My overall thoughts, it is going to take you a bit of time to wrap your head around everything and all of the moving pieces. So there are some gaps that are going to require some more heavy improv, and there's not a lot of handouts to help support the investigation. So just be aware of those things as you're prepping this scenario. I really enjoyed the story and the setting, and meshing everything with the fairy tales was really unique and fun. So lean into that fairy tale lore, maybe look up some things to help you with local stories, and really bring that to life for your players. If you want to check it out, the scenario is linked in the description below, and I love reviewing Miskatonic Repository scenarios, so if you have your own you want me to check out, please reach out to me. My website will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!